Historical fiction brings history to life by placing appealing child characters in accurately described historical settings. By telling the stories of these characters' everyday lives as well as presenting their triumphs and failures, authors of historical fiction provide young readers with the human side of history, making it more real and more memorable. Definition and description. Historical fiction is a realistic fiction set in a time remote enough from the present to be considered history. That is, although the story imaginary, it is within the realm of possibility that such events could have occurred. In this story, historical facts blend with imaginary characters and plot. The facts are actual historical events, authentic period settings, and real historical figures. An imaginary story is constructed around these facts. In the reference guide in historical fiction for children and young adults, Adamson 1987 states, historical fiction recreate a particular historical period with or without historical figures as incidental characters. It is generally written about a time period in which the author has not lived or no more recently than one per generation before its composition. For example, fiction written in 1987 must be set at the latest in 1967 to be considered historical fiction written in 1930 but set in 1925 does not fulfill this criterion for legitimate historical fiction. In the most common form of historical fiction, the main characters of the story are imaginary, but some secondary characters may be actual historical figures. An example of the type of historical fiction is the 1944 Newbery Medal winner Johnny Freeman by Hesder Forbes, set in the U.S. Revolutionary War period. This story tells of Johnny, a fiction character who is apprenticed to a silversmith. In the course of the story, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere are introduced as minor characters. In another form of historical fiction, the part is described complete with the social tradition, customs, morals, and values of the period, but with no mention of an actual historical event nor actual historical figures as characters. The physical location is also accurately reconstructed for the readers. An example of this story types is The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. The Puritan way of life is Connecticut in the 1600s is depicted in this story about young kid from Barbados who becomes involved in a witchcraft trial. The locales and tradition are accurate reconstructions of Puritan life of the era, whereas the characters' dialogue, day-to-day events, and details are fictions. Both these forms of historical stories. Quality as historical fiction under the definition of this genre. A third type of historical story is one in which elements of fantasy are found and therefore the story does not equality as historical fiction. For example, Time Warpa and other supernatural features may be found in Canadian Janet Lance the Rothschild and in Jane Yolens The Devil's Arithmetic. These stories are historical fantasy and are included in chapter 6 modern fantasy pictures book books in his story fictions genre are discussed in chapter 4 pictures book.
Hi everyone, my name is Rasmia Dupima and today we will tackle about evaluation and selection of historical fiction. Historical fiction must first be evaluated for its story strength. Dapat nimo siya i-evaluate first for its validity of the story. It must tell an engaging story, an attractive story so people will get interested. The author must develop rounded, complex characters with whom children can identify. The author should also develop a universal theme that is worthy and thought-provoking without being didactic or instructive or particularly having moral instruction as an ulterior motive. The author of historical fiction must present historical facts, a facts that has accuracy and objectivity as books of history. This means that a setting must be described in sufficient, sakto na mga detalye to provide an authentic census, tinuod ng mga events of the time and place. Without overwhelming the story, wala nila gipasobraan. Details such as hair and clothing styles, have home architecture and furnishing foods, and food preparation, and modes of transportations must be subtly woven or dili directly mabantayan na nahimo or gihimo na siya in the story to provide a convincing, authentic period setting, and the characters must act within the traditions and norms, the usual, typical of their times. Expressing the language or dialect of the period presents a particular challenge to the author of historical stories. Challenging ni siya para sa ilaha. Dialogue that occurs within the text often becomes problematic for the writer, especially if the speech of the period is greatly different from that of today. Ilahang words na ginagamit adto sa una lahira sa wordings nato karon. So, the author must decide if she remains true to the language of the time. Gamiton tong wordings sa una that cause readers difficulties in comprehending. Whether gamiton yung mga words sa una nga maglisod ang mga readers pagsabot, or present the language in today's dialect, or gamiton itong mga wordings karon but lose the flavor and authenticity of the language. Kung sa pagkaon pa, wala na ilami. Of the period, it seems important that the language not jar the readers by its obvious inappropriateness or lose the reader by its extreme difficulty. Papatili sila mawalan og mga reader tungod kay lisod sabton ilahang mga wordings. Most children's authors strive to attain The middle ground, some flavor of the language differences, but modified to be understandable to the child readers, young listeners, adapt easy. So, most authors kay nagamit nila itong mga words nga dali lang makasabot ang mga bata o mga middle age, mga young prenatal child. A child can easily understand or adapt to dialects when they are modeled well by their teachers. Natudluan og sakto, and may even find occasions to use the dialect to lend flavor to their subsequent writing. Many adults now are unaware that the history they learned as children may have been biased or one-sided or unfair or focus lang sa good things sa isa ka tao dili na magtanaw tong sa isa pod. The criteria for evaluating historical fictions are as follows. An engrossing story with well-developed characters. It should be an interesting story, nakakaaliw. An interesting plot, worthy but subtle themes. An authentic, kinud-anay with well-described setting that informs the reader but does not overwhelm the story. Wala gipasubraan. Historical accuracy in describing places, events, and facts, morals, manners, customs, and behavior of people. And the Scott Odell Award, an award established in 1981 by the author Scott Odell and administered by Zana Sutherland, honors what is judged to be the most outstanding work of children's historical fiction published in the children's or historical fiction published in the previous year. The work must be written by a U.S. citizen and be set in the New World.
I'm Irish Osonero and I'm going to cover the topic Early Books and Trend in Historical Fiction. These topics still belong to Chapter 8, Historical Fiction. So, historical stories for children is written as early as 1800s, and this book emphasizes about exciting events and idealized real-life character like heroic legends. So that is their trend, that is their pattern during the time. However, when Howard Pale's novels Otto of the Silver Hand in 1888 and Men of Iron in 1891, these novels of Howard Pale's became an exemption to this pattern. And this is followed by Eric Kelly, who won a Newberg Medal for the Trumpeter Crocow, which this story depicted about the two children who outwit the Tartans who capture one of their father. So this book is written from 1930 are not remarkable for children today. They are considered not remarkable for children today. However, in 1932 and 1943, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote a series of books with the title Little House. Her work became very popular as a result of long-lasting television series based on this book. The work of Carol Paris and The Cadler Woodland about a boyish girl and the work of Estelle Forbes, Johanne Tremaine are still read and enjoyed by children today. 15 years after the World War II, many outstanding books were published, such as The Door in the Wall by Margaret DeAngeli in 1949, The Buffalo Knife by William O'Steele in 1952, The Courage of Sarah by Alice Dalglish in 1954, The Sword in the Tree by Clyde Robert Bolia in 1959, and many more. And the 1954 became significant to children's fiction book writer because Laura Ingalls Wilder Award was created. This award was named after Laura Ingalls herself. This became the Hall of Fame after for award for all children's authors and illustrators that made a substantial and long-lasting contribution to children's literature. Although historical fiction continues to flourish until these days, some older historical fiction novels have been criticized for portraying some cultural groups in an extremely negative way, in extremely negative light. A good example for this negative portrayal are Caddy Woodland by Carol Perry Brink, The Matchlock Gun by Walter D. Edmonds. They are all criticized and faulted because of their negative portrayal of Native Americans. Meanwhile, the establishment in 1981 of the Scott O'Daly Award for Historical Fiction has begun to offer additional recognition for the author of this genre.
Hello and good day everyone. By the way, my name is Mix Kiliano Rebelio from BC2 Section 1. And for this video, we'll talk about the topics in historical fiction. Two ways of considering the topics treated in historical fiction. Novels are by the universal themes presented in the books and by the historical periods in which the books are set. First, some common themes that can be found within historical fiction novels for children are suggested with titles of books in which the theme is developed. Next, 6 historical periods in which historical fiction novels can be found are reviewed in capsule form. These are the milestones in the development of historical fiction. In 1888, Otto of the Silver Hand by Howard Pyle. It is early recognized work of historical fiction. In 1929, the Newbery Medal given to the chapter of Krakow by Eric Kelly. It is a national recognition for an early work of historical fiction. In 1989, Elizabeth George Spear, awarded by the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. It is a recognition of an author of historical fiction for her substantial contribution to children's literature. In 1932 to 1943, publication of first 8 books of Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. It is a classic historical fiction. In 1944, Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes given the Newbery Medal. It is a classic historical adventure set during the American Revolution era. In 1949 to 1960, many historical novels published including The Poor in the World by Margaret D. Angeli, The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear, The Lantern Bearers by Rosemary Sutcliffe. It is a dramatic increase in the quantity of historical novels for children. In 1954, establishment of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, first awarded to Wilder, recognition of an historical fiction author for the entire body of her work. In 1961, Scott O'Dell's Island of the Blue Dolphins awarded the Newbery Medal. It is a landmark book of historical fiction with a strong female protagonist from a minority culture. The themes in historical fiction. First is the Seeking New Frontiers. It is a Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Second, The Search for Freedom from Persecution. Sing Down the Moon by Scott O'Dell. Third, Effects of War. My Brother Sam is Dead by James Lincoln Collier. And lastly, Family Closeness in Times of Adversity. It is Sounder by William H. Armstrong. Periods of history in fiction. First, beginnings of civilization up to 300 BC. Second, civilizations of the ancient world 300 BC to AD 600. Third, civilizations of the medieval world 600 to 1500s. And lastly, the emergence of modern nations 1500s to 1800s. The Renaissance, a literary and artistic movement, swept Western Europe. Many important developments of this period included the invention of the printing press, a new emphasis on reason, a reformation of the Christian church, and advance in science. Revolutions created new governments and nations. The American Revolution started from 1776 up to 1781, created a nation. The French Revolution in 1789 affected the direction of governments towards democracy in all Europe. Japan prospered under the Tokugawa shogunate. The United States and Canada were the sites of rapid population increase due to immigration. The state settlements in North America were predominantly along the eastern coast. For example, a story relating the challenges of settling the main frontier in 1700s is Elizabeth George Spears, The Sign of the Beaver. And that's all. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark Tingson Brochov from BC2 Section 1, and my will discuss the historical fiction. Historical fiction is kind of fiction that is set in the past. It has a rich mixture of fact and fiction, meaning a writer or an author may combine factual information about time, place, events, and real people of the period with fictional characters, dialogue, and details. Historical fiction helps the reader to experience or have an idea of what it was like to live during the era when the story takes place. Characteristics of historical fiction. Historical fiction doesn't conflict with historical records. That is, it is said to be a well-told story. Portrays characters realistically, artfully, folds in historical facts, avoid stereotypes and myths, believable setting and characters, plot supported by historical evidence. Historical fiction tells first a compelling story and relates it to historical information. World War I was one of the great watersheds of 20th century geopolitical history. It led to the fall of four great imperial dynasties in Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey. Resulted in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and in its destabilization of European society, laid the groundwork for World War II. World War II began in September 1939, when Britain and France declared war on Germany, following Germany's invasion of Poland. Although the outbreak of war was triggered by Germany's invasion of Poland, the causes of World War II are more complex. That's all. Thank you.